Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and it's my pleasure today to have as my guest Dr. See, I was mixing up your name already. I was going to say your last name is Dr. SARAMO, but it's Samira.
Yes.
Welcome, Samira.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Cool. You can mix up my name anytime you want. It's totally fair. So, I've known you for a number of years, and I've been a big fan in terms of the research you've been doing on history. I was a history major in school, and so I don't know, it's a natural fit anyways. But let's go back to some early years. Are you a local Thunder Bayite, or where'd you grow up?
Well, Thunder Bay I think of as being my hometown, but I was born in Finland and then moved as a kid to New Brunswick. And then as a teen, my family made their way to Thunder Bay. And then, of course, I've been here and away over the years, but it keeps pulling me back. So yeah, Thunder Bay.
Now, is there a Finnish community in New Brunswick? When I was in northern New Brunswick, I felt like the landscape was so close to Thunder Bay.
That's true, and we lived in Bathurst in New Brunswick, which is in the north there, but very few Finns actually, and that was one of the reasons that my parents in particular were eager to jump at a chance to move to Thunder Bay when it came up, because they were craving that familiar Finnish culture. So yeah.
So we've got a bit of that here in Thunder Bay.
Absolutely.
So now, how did you end up being a historian? What kind of educational voyage was that like?
Yeah, I guess, you know, some of us are just pulled in the history direction, probably because we have good imaginations of what different times and places may have been like. But yeah, so ever since starting my undergraduate after high school at Trent University, I studied English first, thinking that would be the way, but then the history courses that I was taking were so interesting that I started focusing more and more on that. Did my master's in history at Lakehead here in Thunder Bay, and then really got excited about the local history, and in particular the Finnish immigrant history, and went on to do a PhD at York University, again in the history program. And then now, since 2015, I've been at the University of Turku in Finland at the John Morton Center for North American Studies. So it's been really neat being there, because even though I'm a historian, I'm working in a very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research center. So I'm getting to try out different things and learn from people with different backgrounds, and I think it's been really fun.
So tell me a little bit more about the John Morton Center. So, I mean, you're in Finland, and I'm kind of going, John Morton in Finland, how does this all work?
Right. So I guess John Morton Center got its name from a signatory of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, who is said to have been a Finnish immigrant, or a Finnish Swede immigrant. So that's like I guess a natural namesake for a Center for North American Studies. It's been really great to be there, actually, because when I joined in 2015, the center had only been operating for a year. And the first time that I had a sit down with our center's director, my boss, Dr. Benita Heiskanen, she said to me, "We don't have a precedent for how we do things," and because it was new, and that's a very exciting thing, you know, to be told. And it's been really great to be a part of this growing team there and a growing center, and to kind of figure out together what our center is and how it operates. And I think it's been really great to be a part of that. And we've got a cool team working on all kinds of different stuff. Our main focus is on transnational North American studies. So I'll give you a few examples. The center has a big research project right now that looks at, for example, how everyday ordinary Cubans and their cities are impacted by the changing relationship between the United States and Cuba. the kind of grassroots local level of what that looks like. Another big project there is looking at the kind of implications on everyday lives of legislation in the United States, campus carry laws, that allows concealed weapons to be brought onto university campuses, and the kinds of activism that goes along with that, and also the support of that movement. And then we've got people looking at US politics and its ramifications on environmental issues internationally. We've got some Asia, North American research going on, stuff about indigenous activism and rights movements, both historically and today. And then I'm bringing this kind of immigrant, and especially Finnish immigrant perspective, and bringing the kind of Canadian voice to our team there. So yeah, it's a great place to be.
Well, I'm getting all jealous here because part of my love of history is to try to understand where we are now.
Right.
And what some of the next steps can be.
Right.
Though my knowledge of history is so much focused on North America, where around the world, it's like every country, every community is almost like its own social experiment.
Right.
And they choose different ways. And I've been really interested looking at Scandinavia and Finland as one of those, of how they're dealing with a lot of the same issues we deal with here, oftentimes in a very different way. So being able to see how things are done in different ways, in different countries, how they came to be that way, can really be helpful when we've got those choices here, facing us. What do we do next?
Exactly.
In terms of, like Thunder Bay, building a better, more inclusive city.
Yep.
that allows people to participate in many ways that now our development that actually created barriers sometimes to some of those participation.
Yeah, and I think it's like the kind of big issues are the same from place to place. Questions of equality and inclusion, questions about the environment, of course, questions about how the economy and the environment work together, and all of those things. And so I think it's really important to look to different places to see how those things are being addressed, and what kind of work is being done. And maybe we have that double-edged situation right now, because with the internet as such a huge part of our daily lives, for the most part, we have access to other experiences, other perspectives more than ever, yet we very easily get stuck in our own bubbles, and then we forget to actually look outside of those. So we need to, I think, push ourselves to get involved in some different conversations. And that's one thing I think at the center that we're trying to do too, with the different scholars we come in, the way that we participate in the Finnish media and Finnish public, and just to encourage dialogue on a lot of these different issues, and to look at the history of it, and to look at the current situation too.
Well, that's a good introduction to getting into a little bit of your own research. We're going to need to take a short break. Please stay with us, and then we're going to find out a little bit more about the Finnish experience here in North America and Thunder Bay. Stay with us. Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Dr. Samira SARAMO, who is now teaching at a university in Finland I can't pronounce.
University of Turku, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. So in the first section, we talked a little bit about the center and kind of the whole area of research and history. Now, what is some of the work you're currently involved in? You're doing something about death and mourning.
Yes.
In what time period? What are we looking at here?
So it's funny that I told you about all the cool contemporary work we're doing at the center, but right now I'm pretty firmly a historian too, because I had the great fortune of having this project funded by the Academy of Finland. So I get to spend all of my attention and energy right now on building this new project that's going to lead to a book. So it's a very exciting time for me with that. So yeah, so I'm looking at the period from the 1880s to the end of 1930, just as the war gets started. And the reason that I'm looking at that time period is because that's when we start to have the first kind of big wave of Finnish immigrants coming to Canada and the United States. And over those first decades, we begin to see the emergence of those Finnish immigrant communities. And they take that kind of formative, and by the time we get to the beginning of World War II, they're really flourishing communities with all kinds of organizations and institutions that are a part of them.
And you mentioned waves of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Were there kind of like a whole bunch of people coming at a certain time period for it? So how many of those waves has there been in that time period, that 40 years?
Yeah, so
Or
in
60 years,
60 years in this project. So in the 1880s into kind of the first years of the 20th century, a lot of Finns coming. And then there, I'm trying to think here. I don't want to mess up the years, but there's also like the World War I. During that period, there isn't really any migration.
Mm-hmm.
It starts to build up a little bit again, but then with the Great Depression, and then once you get into the Second World War, again it basically comes to a standstill because the countries can't accept immigrants to come. There isn't work or because of war, and then again after the Second World War, there's another big wave of immigrants. So usually we talk about kind of 3 waves. Yeah.
So now your focus is on death and mourning.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you finding there? What are some of your uncoverings?
Yeah, so the way that I kind of came to this project, it's been brewing in my mind for about a decade, really, studying other parts of Finnish immigrant life. But I was struck by how often you come across these quite extensive descriptions of experiences with death and mourning in the Finnish immigrant community. And I started to wonder, what exactly did that mean? What did it mean to die and mourn kind of in these Finnish immigrant communities? And what was really interesting to me, and the thing that I first started to follow, was the fact that with Finns, like some other immigrant groups as well, one of the very first big forms of organized community life were funeral funds. So that I just had to learn more about why that was happening. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that especially young single men, young single women coming over and working in very dangerous work environments in the bush, building the railroads, in the mines, young girls, young women working in domestic service, dealing with huge boiling water and fires and gas and things like that. And there were a lot of very serious injuries, and there were a lot of fatalities. And there was a sense that, what if that happened to me? What if I die here on the job site? Nobody sends a letter to my mom and dad to tell them that I've died here. What if nobody provides me with a proper burial? And so there was that worry about that. So in that fear of dying alone, immigrants started to come together, and they started to create these funds where they chip in, whatever little part of their wages they could. And then they would be guaranteed, it was usually in the late 19th, early 20th century, like a $50 burial benefit that would guarantee them a funeral, if possible. And if they had family in Canada or the United States, they would get a small something to help the family at that difficult time, and they would also send a letter home if that was needed. So it really filled this really important need for the community. And then to go along with that were all these informal systems as well, and networks that we have now too, which is that you take care of each other at these difficult times. You bring them food, or you offer money, or you're just there to support each other. So that's some of the stuff that I've been getting into so far.
And so how do you see people's reaction to the hazards, in a way? You're talking in a way about hazards in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
How did they deal with, okay, I may die and we're looking after that piece, but while we're still alive, what effect does the fatalities have on the folks that are left behind?
Right. Well, and a big part of that, and right here in the Thunder Bay region, we have this great, rich history of the workers' movements and of many of the different socialist parties that were operating in the early 20th century. And I think that those fatalities played a big part in fueling those movements and gaining such popular support. And I think that the movements understandably and quite well used those risks and that danger of death in their campaigning. For example, I was reading about the lumber workers union here in the Thunder Bay area in the 1920s. And in addition to the demands for increased wages, a big part was on those camp conditions, right? Mm-hmm. And something that I found mentioned over and over again were things like saunas, not only for the cultural part, but for hygiene and cleanliness, mm-hmm. and to shake off that cold. Mm-hmm. And another was drying facilities for clothing, mm-hmm. Because the workers were wet almost all the time, as they still are today, people working in the bush. And when it was so difficult to control infectious diseases or pneumonia, having those facilities at the camps was essential. And so that was an important push for the unions. Then when there were fatalities, especially in mining communities where there might be explosions or cave-ins, that was a time for the community to come together and to mourn and to grieve, and it hits home so much because you think, this time it wasn't my husband, my brother, my son who died in the mine, but it certainly could be next time, or maybe it was last time. And so to come together to support those families and to see that they're all in it together, but also then to use the unions and the parties to put the pressure on the companies to actually do something to support those workers. So I think that I would argue that the death was an important part of that.
We need to take another short break. Please stay with us. We're going to come back and explore this a little bit further. Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Dr. Samira SARAMO, and she's been doing a whole lot of research on a lot of the Finnish experiences here in Thunder Bay and surrounding areas. We were just talking about how the hazardous workplaces, the fatalities that happened at work were opportunities for people to support each other, mm-hmm. but also organize for better working conditions to better protect themselves and their families and countrymen, whatever.
Yeah.
Now, this is not new. I mean, we still hear it, in the news this week, in Israel and Palestine, the people that died are public martyrs and are used for political change. We have a rich history here, yeah. in activism, certainly in the immigrant community. And some of your earlier work was on a particular woman who really took this on big time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I guess she really got me excited about this project, or about this type of research altogether. And we're talking about Sanna Kannasto, who was a key organizer, not just locally and not necessarily just for Finns, but across Canada, well known in the United States, and involved in many of the early socialist parties, and then the Finnish Organization of Canada as well. So she was a Finnish immigrant who was born in the late 1880s, I think, in Finland, and came as a young woman to North America. And she settled here in North Branch, I think is where she had her home here in the rural area. And it's great to find her in the minutes of these Finnish organizations and the Social Democratic Party of Canada. She was a founding member at that founding convention, the Socialist Party of Canada before that. And you see these lists of men's names, you find a few women, but Sanna Kannasto is always there. And in addition to finding her voice in these kind of formal records, she is really interesting in the kind of collective and community history, and the way that she comes across in people's memories, especially women, because here was this woman who wasn't going to take, nobody was going to tell her what to do, and she believed in workers' rights, but she believed in revolution. She very much believed in women's empowerment, emancipation, and women's rights to control their bodies and to control their labor. And she spoke very radically. There are some reports that she would talk about birth control and different issues that the audiences maybe felt a little bit uncomfortable about, so she was certainly ahead of her time. But not only that, so she had been in a common law marriage with another quite significant Finnish organizer whose last name she took, J.V. Kannasto. And of course it was a common law marriage because many of the socialists of the time didn't want anything to do with the church, so they didn't get formally married or have the church recognize their marriages. And then they split, and she ended up being the single parent of their son. But in order to make ends meet, she traveled across the country, she traveled across the US, and she was interrogated and imprisoned several times. And she would carry these massive bundles of books and sell them along the way. She would visit all these small communities off the beaten path to try to organize them, to get them involved in socialism. And she talked about having to turn the little spark into a big fire, and she wrote about how whenever she visited somewhere, the fire was roaring by the time she left, but then it would slowly start to die out again, and how you had to get the organizers to go there to get people to keep working towards revolutionary ends. And she was just a very fascinating character, one of many, that we have yet to learn a lot about. So, yeah.
So, what do we have to learn from her experience in history? I mean, right away I kind of go, Justin Trudeau should be thanking her for half of his cabinet being women, because it took 100 years or more for us to get to this place.
Right.
But what are some of the other things that you've come across that you've reflected on?
Yeah, you and I have chatted about this a fair bit over the years, about how the issues are the same, it seems, and I think we've grown about it quite often. Like, what does it take to really enact change, and why don't these things stick, and why don't those fires keep burning? Why do they keep, fading down, like Kannasto herself said? But we have, I think, just even if anything so simple, just to take that commitment and that enthusiasm, and to not just talk the talk but walk the walk. Because in these organizations, men often said, of course, women need to come out, women need to be, active. But then when you look to the women's experiences, well, somebody had to take care of the kids when the men were at all these meetings, right? Mm-hmm. And so then there were some who worked incredibly hard but found their way, and they walked that walk like Sanna Kannasto. So I think that we can look to that. That I think there's always probably more we could do to pursue whatever is dear to us and an important cause. Just to imagine and work towards a society and a world where people don't have to live in poverty, where people are treated equally, you know, all those things.
And so she, in a way, is inspiring and must have been inspired herself.
Yes.
To really spend years and decades of her life. Was there something that helped her maintain that fire?
Well, she's an interesting character in the sense that...
In 30 seconds is what we have left.
Yeah, I don't know. There's still more to be learned about her, I think. I think she was a complicated figure, and yeah, I don't know what the answer to that one is, Steve.
So, in the last few seconds, where are you off to next?
Well, over the summer, looking forward to visiting all kinds of Finnish immigrant communities in our area and in the Midwest as well, to try to learn more about these experiences and especially about death. Then head back to the John Morton Center and keep going with all the research that I've collected.
Well, Samira, thanks so much for coming on the show. I wish we would have had like 2 hours to talk, because there's so many more things I'd like to explore with you. Good luck in your research, and the next time you're back in Thunder Bay, I hope you come on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and I would gladly come back.
Thanks so much, and catch us on Facebook, Community Conversations. Have a safe week.